Welcome. This is Sally. I'm Sally Treanor, and this is the watercolor series. Today, we're going to work on using brushes and brush strokes and how you hold your brush. We're going to be using magnolias as our subject matter. And the other thing we're going to be uh, kind of spending some time on are branches as something that's living, and we don't do a good job on them sometimes. And I really want to, again, concentrate on how to do that with your brush and how you want to create realism with very few strokes. So let's begin. So first of all, I want everybody to have at least 1/8 of a sheet ready for use. And the first thing I want to do, I guess, is have an actual branch here. And so I have a live subject. You know how I like that. So I just want to do very quickly a suggestion of what's going on here. Now, my magnolias, they're not pink and they're not a red violet. They are somewhere in between. But let's say they are closer to violet than to red. And I'm just adding, I have a puddle here that is cobalt and permanent rose. So this is kind of a red violet. And let's see how that plays on the paper. I'm going to just start with a blossom. I want you to pay attention to how I'm holding my brush. I'm blotting it. I'm coming in with my brush emanating from the center, which is how these guys grow. I'm paying attention to the silhouette. I'll come back later and create, the full flower. But and that's too much violet. So now I'm going to make a puddle that is just permanent rose. Dropping it in, let it flow. The stem, we're going to use Windsor yellow and cobalt. The stem, as it approaches the flower, is a bright green. So always wet stem to wet flower. I want that green to flow up into the flower. That red is moving around in the flower itself now, and now it's got a little of green. And I've just let some of that violet and red run down into the stem. Now, the other thing that happens is that's just the stem for the flower, but the actual branch is another factor indeed. And so we get that by, okay, we're cobalt. And permanent rose. Now I'm pretty saturated now. And yellow. In order to get that brown stem, you have to complete the triad. And the reason I like to make my brown from my triad is that it gives me a much more lively color than like if I were to use Payne's gray or something. So in this case, now this is the branch. I introduce the branch, which is kind of purplish. I'm careful about how thick the branch is. And now let's play the game of drop-in color. Now that branch is pretty light. So let's take some of our purple and drop it in and let it flow. Don't worry that you cannot see purple in your branch. I don't care that you can't. And then let's do some red. So back into our permanent rose. And let's do some blue. But let's come back to our puddle of gray and give it a little more substance. So I'll get some more red in there. Right now it's very juicy. I don't want to be so juicy anymore. Blue, yellow, and let's add to that because this is our +1 when we're using cobalt. I'm putting some French ultramarine in there. All right, now I've really got a thicker puddle, more going on in it. Dropping, again, blot your brush. And one of the things I do have going on here is I've got some green leaves coming out. Again, this is a brush thing. So push down to get a leaf shape and drag it up. Nope, this isn't very dark, so let's get that a little darker. Go over that leaf. And usually those leaves have kind of a rounded shape at the top and a skinny shape down at the bottom. Let's give ourselves another couple. But in the meantime, let's extend our branch. Oops. I'm going to have a blot brush going on here. That had too much paint. So let's extend our branch up to eat the leaf. Now I'm bleeding into the leaf, and the leaf is going to maybe bleed into the little branch. Let's get another branch going. There's another leaf down here. And again, pay attention to how things insert where. I'm dragging from the branch to the leaf. Again, I introduce it into the leaf. The color goes up into the leaf. Now these also have kind of a distinctive vein pattern. The veins are in search of the central vein opposite. Now, because I have all the colors in my puddle of gray that are my triadic colors, I'm getting a beautiful thing happening as that gray fades into the leaves. Let me see. The one thing I don't want to have happen is happening because I can't paint fast enough. And I'm going to come back later to get my dark little ticks on this because there are areas where there are gnarly things happening. This isn't dry enough yet to separate out the petals. Let's give ourselves a bud. Now the buds, interestingly, are darker than the flowers. So here's a bud. Again, thicker at the bottom, comes up to not quite a point, but kind of a point. So the brush is important here. You want to do that in one stroke if you can. So apply it, press down, drag the brush up to the end so it's narrower at the end. Now, one of the things that happens with buds is that, remember, there's that spath on the daffodils. The same kind of tissue surrounds buds. So I'm using some of that brown and gray to create that happening with our bud here. And remember that the stems of the buds are green. And then this one happens to be surrounded by some leaves. So let's get those in there. And let's get our branch in there. And I'm touching all the wet leaves with that branch. Have it bleed into the wet leaves. This leaf already started to dry. Remember, all these leaves, you start with that press hard, drag out while they're wet. Put in some veins. Pay attention to where they insert. Again, it started to dry too soon. So I can go back into this dry leaf and just go over it again. Doesn't matter at this point. And now that branch is bleeding into it. So let's come back here to, let's make this branch too thick. I'll come back to erase that somewhat with my bristle brush, but right now I wanted to stop my carelessness from getting in my way. All right, I've given myself a new branch to play with. Let's see what I can do with that. Let's drop some of this puddle into it. Get some dark areas. Dark area here where it inserts into the bigger branch. I'll just kind of introduce that water there. I'll let it become part of it. And let's get all those colors going on in this branch. One of the things that happens for me when I do this is I get so tickled with this after it's dry and I see all the colors in the branch and they don't really make sense because they're not in the painting itself. I mean in the actual branch, but they're so much more beautiful if they have all those colors in them. This is still wet, so I can give myself more veins. And it's still wet, so I can actually give myself more bleed into that leaf and make it more interesting. And again, because my gray brown has all of the colors in my triad, we're getting just some interesting color in those leaves. That's quite nice, even though they're bright green. The other thing that is happening right here is I have another little bud. Let's give ourselves another little bud right here. It's almost entirely covered by that spath or whatever it is on these. I'll paint next to it and let it bleed into it. And then let's give ourselves that green stem, which we can barely see. But we also have to give ourselves some of these little baby leaves. And that leaf actually will touch over here. So that'll bleed into the flower. And now we have that branch that's come out from here, comes in behind that leaf, touches here. And again, we drop in some color. And anytime it's wet, we can drop in color and make some of that interesting stuff happen. And I'm getting a blossom here and here because this is, again, it's so dry in here. Re-wet the leaf. Let's give it some veins so that we know it's a leaf because now it has lots of red in it. Be careful when you're doing the veins to follow the contour of a leaf that is changing its direction and doing weird things. This is dry enough now to separate the blossoms. Let's go back to our puddle over here. This petal is in back. I'm going to use my blot brush to lose the edge. The petals have kind of a prominent, let's see what's happening here. This one's in back. Lose the edge. You don't have to do a lot at this point. And you don't always want to lose the edges either. One of the things that is happening here, and then here, just a touch here and there. One of the things I don't like is the way this just gave me a rough little edge there that I don't especially like. Just, I bristled a little bit to take it out, or at least lessen it. So let's go back to the notion of hard edge, lost edge for negative painting. Let's look at this bud. How do we separate that spath or sepal, whatever that is in back, from the flower itself? We don't need a lot of value for this, but we do need the color of the bud. So I'm going to define the edge of that's around by painting next to it, and it's good and dry now too. And that's on both sides. It wraps the flower. I'm going to lose the edge away from what I was defining. And now I'm going to come in with pure red, a little darker because the bud itself is darker. And I'm painting over what I just did to define that negatively. Come back in with just my clear water, not a lot, just enough to wet it enough to have a bleed place. So now I have changed that into a bud. I could come back in and continually work on the flower itself too. Let's do a little of that. Uh, again with clear red. Doing a red area, and then come back in with just plain water. Let it bleed. So I'm starting to give it a little more dimension than it had before, and a little more nice color. But let's get a little more exciting. Pick up some green, blot your brush, and drop that into that new wet area, just to introduce that color into the new red area that we put in there. Let's do that again over here. So I could keep doing that, but I'm not gonna. Um, let's talk about mistakes. This branch, too thick right here. Don't like that. So I'm gonna make that branch continue on. And I'll just let it end there. I might come back and do something different with it. But one of the things I like very much to do is, now that the branch is dry elsewhere, let's do some little tickies where things join, and just little irregularities that are. So I'm taking my branch color and coming in this second go round, and I'm looking at the way things happen when one thing comes off and another thing starts, and I'm just giving my branch some character, and I'm just making little touches with that darker color, branch color. And it's darker, just not because it's actually darker, it's just another layer. Let's paint the branch a little bit behind this leaf. Make things happen here. Let's do the same thing with this bud that we did before with this bud, which is further along, but this bud is actually hasn't even started to open. So I'm going to come back into that bud with just green and see what happens. Maybe give it the illusion that is, yeah, not bad. I kind of like that. And when I look closely at that bud, there's stuff happening in there that will benefit from some veining. And that veining is different from the veining on the leaves. I'm liking my leaves pretty much, but let's look at this leaf up here. It doesn't have much character. I'm going to come in with my just plain water brush, my blot brush, wet it, and let's come in with, now this is a new layer on top of dry leaf. I'm dropping some red into my leaf. Make sure to wet the whole leaf. So I've given a little glow to that. And let's come in also with some blue. See what happens. Oh yeah, that's starting to look way more interesting. And let's also come in with more green. I think it's interesting also maybe to come in with some yellow. Let's see what happens with that. Now, you'll notice when you're doing this on a dry leaf that it is different, much different from just dropping in color when it's all still wet. This is lots cleaner. You're dropping a new layer on top of something that's already there, but it's dry. It's a transparent layer, so you're seeing through this new layer, and the transparent bottom layer that's dry is still vibrant. Let's do that with another leaf. Again, come in with your just plain water brush. Let's wet this whole leaf. And you just want it damp. You don't want standing water. Let's do the same thing. Let's first drop in maybe some blue. Let's see what happens when I do that. We'll bring some of it down into the branch. Let's do some red. Follow your brush. Don't put it right on top of the blue. You want this to work by itself. Bit of green. Green on top of green is always interesting. And that final bit of yellow, I think, really brings it to life. It's quite nice. So do that to where it's appropriate to the leaves that aren't very interesting to you yet. I have helped this somewhat by continuing the branch beyond because this was too thick coming up to the leaf. The leaf is more, should be kind of spriggy. Like this one. This one is working just right. This one's working just right. This one's working just right. My point is that you really have to be careful when you are drawing those branches so that they are the appropriate thickness. I liken it to what we talk about when we're talking about how trees grow. When the trunk comes out of the ground, that is the thickest part of anything on a tree. As branches leave, as limbs leave the trunk diminishes in size. So that way at the top, the trunk might be a little tiny in diameter area, whereas the bottom could be quite thick, even in a big mature tree. The same thing happens with the twigs and branches that come off the tree itself. So the main branch that comes off of a tree is thicker, and every time something comes off of it, becomes a leaf or a flower, it diminishes the size of the branch on which it depends. It's an observation thing. If you ignore it, all of a sudden that branch ceases to be as realistic. It's not that we're looking for hyper-realism here. What we're looking for is a semblance of how things are in the world.